Hello and welcome to this Biology 6 lecture on the endocrine system. So in the previous lecture, actually the couple of lectures ago, we talked about the nervous system. And remember the nervous system is for rapid communication between body parts. Remember that nerve signals, or action potentials as they are correctly called, action potentials travel between body parts at a speed of around 200 miles per hour. Well, the body has a second entirely different system of communication between body parts, and that's the endocrine system. So just to recap that, both the nervous system and the endocrine system are for signaling between body parts, but the endocrine system is an entirely different system. It uses an entirely different way to communicate between body parts than the action potentials that the nervous system uses. Okay, so yeah, the endocrine system is for communication between body parts. Maybe I should now mention, well, what types of things does the body use the endocrine system for? In other words, what types of things in the body does the endocrine system regulate? Well, the endocrine system regulates functions like growth and development. So, we all started out as little newborn babies, and then over the next decade or two, we grow and grow and grow until we eventually become adults. So our growth and development is regulated by the endocrine system. Our metabolism, which is all the chemical reactions that go on inside us, your metabolic reactions are regulated by the endocrine system. And reproduction, the reproductive organs, both in males and females, are regulated by the endocrine system. So let me mention something about the signaling of the endocrine system. So the signaling in the endocrine system is slower than the signaling in the nervous system. But the effects of the endocrine system, even though they're a little slower to travel around in the body, are generally stronger and more longer lasting than the signaling of the nervous system. Okay, well, let's now drill down a little deeper and talk about how the signaling works in the endocrine system. So the signaling in the endocrine system always starts off with a structure known as an endocrine gland. And in this diagram, I'm showing that yellow structure right there as an example of an endocrine gland. But there are actually several different endocrine glands all throughout the body. So don't get the idea that there's only one and it's located right there. No, there's lots of them all throughout the entire body. Anyway, the signaling always starts with an endocrine gland. It sends out the signal, and it does so. It sends out a signal by secreting a hormone into the bloodstream. These little blue dots in this cartoon represent the hormones that are being secreted, and as you can kind of see, they are traveling out from the endocrine gland in the bloodstream. In other words, the endocrine glands secrete hormones into the bloodstream. Okay, and so those molecules that the endocrine gland is secreting are called hormones, and we define those as molecules that are chemical signaling molecules that travel in the bloodstream. Now, there's actually many different types of hormones. In this diagram, I'm only showing one type of hormone that I'm representing by this blue dot, but there's actually several dozens of different types of hormones that your body uses. Okay, yeah, so the endocrine gland secretes the hormones into the bloodstream, and the bloodstream travels everywhere in the body, so those hormones travel everywhere in the body. And that kind of brings us back to the definition of the endocrine system. If you look in the lecture outline, it defines the endocrine system as a system of communication between body parts by signal molecules, hormones, that are secreted into the bloodstream. All right, so yeah, these when an endocrine gland secretes a hormone into the bloodstream, that hormone goes everywhere in the body because the bloodstream goes everywhere in the body. So each and every organ in the body is exposed to that hormone, but kind of strangely, only a small number of organs will respond to the hormone. We call those the target organs of the hormone. So even though all the organs in the body are exposed to the hormone, only a small number, like typically one or two organs in the body, actually respond to the hormone. The rest of the organs in the body just ignore the hormone, even though they are exposed to it. here's kind of a zoomed out view. You see these hormones traveling everywhere in our body, so all our organs are getting exposed to them. But yeah, only a small number of organs, 1 or 2 organs typically, will actually respond to the organ. Will only respond to the hormone, and we call those the target organs of the hormone. And so that hopefully will strike you as kind of interesting and intriguing. You might say, well, if all the organs in the body get exposed to that hormone, how could it possibly be that only 1 or 2 organs respond? How can there only be just a small number of target organs that respond to it? Well, that is an interesting question, and let me now kind of elaborate on it. Oh, actually, before I tell you about how it is that only a small number of target organs respond to the hormone, let me mention one last thing, that when the target organ does respond to the hormone, the target organ is pre-programmed to take some sort of specific action. And you might wonder, well, what is the specific action of the target organ? Well, that really depends on which hormone we're talking about and which target organ we're talking about. But each target organ will always have some kind of action that it carries out when it gets exposed to the hormone. Okay, but what I was about to talk about was, how is it that only the target organ responds to the hormone when all the organs in your body are exposed to the hormone? Well, to explain this, how that works, let's kind of zoom in on some blood vessels here. This area right here is some blood vessel in the body, and this is going to be the endocrine gland in this explanation. So this is going to be the structure that secretes the hormones into the bloodstream, and this right here, these cells right here, are going to represent the cells of the target organ, the organ that's going to respond to the hormone. And these kind of greenish colored cells right here are going to represent some non-target organ, one of the organs in the body that doesn't respond to the hormone. Okay, so here's the endocrine gland secreting the hormones into the bloodstream. And yeah, just like I was telling you, the non-target organs, even though they get exposed to the hormone, they completely ignore it, don't have any response at all. Only the target organ responds to the hormone. So our question is, well, how is that possible? And the short answer is receptor proteins. We talked about receptor proteins earlier in the semester. They are proteins that you find in the membrane of a cell, and each receptor protein has a binding site that's exactly shaped to fit just the molecule it's supposed to bind to. And so what allows the target organ to be the one that responds to the hormone is the cells of the target organ have the right receptors to fit that hormone, to bind to that hormone. The non-target organs in the body, they might have some other receptors, maybe some receptors to some different hormones or some other substances, but the non-target organs just don't have the right receptor to bind to the hormone. And so that's why the non-target organs are going to ignore that hormone. They just can't bind to it. Their receptors just don't fit it. But the target organ does have the right receptors, and so it can bind the hormone, and when it does, it then carries out its pre-programmed response to the hormone. Okay, yeah, so that's the secret of how only the target organ can responds to the hormone. So remember that the endocrine system, its hormones regulate things like growth and development and metabolism and reproduction. But I want to bring up an interesting point here. How do these endocrine glands know when they're supposed to be releasing a hormone, and how do they know how much of that hormone that they're supposed to secrete into the bloodstream? What tells an endocrine gland when it's time to secrete its hormone? And oftentimes it is a timing thing. When you're young, there's an endocrine gland in your body that secretes a lot of a hormone called growth hormone to make you grow at the right time and grow at the proper rate. So how does the endocrine gland that secretes growth hormone, for example, how does that know when it's time in your lifetime to start secreting the growth hormone? Well, here's the way it works. Oftentimes, an endocrine gland is controlled by hormones that are secreted by some other endocrine gland. So what I'm saying is, oftentimes there's some other endocrine gland that secretes hormones that bind to this endocrine gland and tell it when it's supposed to secrete its hormones. Here we see some of those hormones right there. And the term for that sort of hormone, the term for a hormone that whose job it is to stimulate another endocrine gland to release its hormone. Those types of hormones are called tropic hormones. They're sometimes also called releasing hormones, which I guess kind of makes sense because they cause this other endocrine gland to release, to secrete its hormones. But usually we call these hormones tropic hormones. Good, yeah, so these tropic hormones that are secreted from this endocrine gland, they bind to the receptors for them on this endocrine gland, and now this endocrine gland knows that it's time for it to secrete its hormone, which will go to the target organ for those hormones, and that target organ will do its pre-programmed response. Now I know what you're thinking. You're saying, okay, Mr. Smarty Pants, what tells this endocrine gland when it's time to secrete its hormone? Well, sometimes there might even be yet another endocrine gland upstream of there that has its own tropic hormones. There we go. So this one might have a tropic hormone that binds to receptors on this endocrine gland and tells this endocrine gland to release its tropic hormones, which this endocrine gland has receptors for, and so now this endocrine gland knows it's time to release its hormones, which then eventually go to the target organ, and you get the target organ's pre-programmed response. So it's kind of crazy, right? It's like there's levels on top of levels on top of levels of endocrine glands controlling other endocrine glands, which control yet other endocrine glands. Anyway, so the point is that any hormone whose target organ is another endocrine gland to regulate the secretion of hormones by that other endocrine gland, we call those tropic hormones. So that's a tropic hormone, and that's a tropic hormone. Oh, yeah, so you may wonder, well, what controls the secretion of hormones from this endocrine gland? Well, at the highest level, it's the nervous system. Usually there are parts of your brain that ultimately control the first endocrine glands, so to speak. And once those ones secrete their tropic hormones, then there's kind of a cascade of one endocrine gland controlling the next, until you finally get down to the last hormone that binds to the target organ. Okay, well, let me go back to our definition of a hormone. So a hormone, remember, is a molecule that functions as a signal molecule and that travels in the bloodstream. All right, well, I think I mentioned it, and you can see here that there are several different types of hormones. The body has dozens of different types of hormones. That being said, endocrinologists, which are the biologists who study the endocrine system, endocrinologists classify all hormones into three groups. In other words, there are three families of hormones. One of these families of hormones, one of these types of hormones are called the amine hormones. And as you can read in your lecture handout, the amine hormones are modified amino acids. This is supposed to be a protein. And remember that proteins are biological macromolecules whose monomers are amino acids. So for most amino acids in your body, the job of those amino acids is to get linked together to form a protein. But for some amino acids, they have another job they can do. With some amino acids, the body can modify those amino acids, and the modified amino acid can function as a hormone. And so we call that type of hormone an amine hormone, hormones that are modified amino acids. There are other hormones in the body that are proteins. So the hormone is not just a modified amino acid. The hormone is a whole chain of amino acids linked together, a protein. And we call those types of hormones protein hormones. Sometimes they are called peptide hormones, but I usually use the term protein hormone, hormones that are polymers of amino acids. The third type of hormone are different from the ones you see here. The third type of hormone are called steroid hormones, and they look like what you see here. So we talked about steroids when we talked about the lipid macromolecules. Steroids are a type of lipid. Each steroid molecule is made out of 4 fused rings of carbon. You can see this here, 1, 2, 3, 4 fused rings of carbon. So any molecule that has this backbone of 4 fused rings of carbon is a steroid, and all steroids have this backbone of 4 fused rings of carbon. Okay, so there are many different types of steroids in the body, and they're used for various purposes. But many of these steroid molecules in the body are used as hormones, and if that's the type of hormone it is, we call it a steroid hormone. So steroid hormones are hormones that have a backbone of four fused rings, like you see here. The next slide shows some examples of these steroid hormones. Cortisol is, well, you can see it. It's an example of a steroid hormone because it has that backbone of the four fused rings of carbon. There's another hormone, steroid hormone called aldosterone. You see here. Here's testosterone, the male hormone. That's also a steroid hormone. Estrogen and progesterone, the female hormones, are also steroid hormones. Now notice that even though all of these steroid hormones have the steroid backbone of the four fused rings of carbon, they have different atoms, different carbons and hydrogens and oxygens attached to the steroid backbone. That's what makes them distinct hormones from each other, but nevertheless they all have the steroid backbone. Okay, just to briefly summarize, there are three major types of hormones in the body: amine hormones, protein hormones, and steroid hormones. Okay, let me get back to the endocrine glands, the structures in the body that secrete hormones. There are many different endocrine glands all throughout the body. This figure shows the major endocrine glands of the body. And we're going to go through, in this lecture, we're going to go through not all of these, but several of these endocrine glands. The one we're going to start with is one of the most important. It's called the pituitary gland. You can see it's labeled right there, and let's kind of have a close-up. So the pituitary gland is located underneath, and it's connected to the hypothalamus of the brain. So let's kind of remember our brain regions. Remember that the four major regions of the brain are the cerebrum, colored in yellow there, the diencephalon, colored in light and dark purple there, the brain stem, colored in green, and the cerebellum, colored in sort of reddish there. Okay, and you might remember that the diencephalon is divided into two major regions, the thalamus and the hypothalamus being shown there in dark purple. Okay, so what I'm saying is that the pituitary gland is an endocrine gland, a hormone-secreting gland, and the pituitary gland is located beneath and connected to the hypothalamus. Matter of fact, let me kind of add it in. Okay, so yeah, there is the pituitary gland. Now, if you look kind of closely, it almost looks like the pituitary gland has two sort of lobes to it, and in fact it does. Let me kind of zoom in on it. So here's the hypothalamus in dark purple there, and here are the two lobes of the pituitary gland. This lobe of the pituitary gland, the one that I'm showing in lighter purple, is called the anterior pituitary, and the lobe of the pituitary gland that I'm showing in dark purple is called the posterior pituitary. And even though the pituitary gland has these two regions, it's still considered just one gland. Okay, but that being said, the anterior pituitary is made out of a different tissue than the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is made out of epithelial tissue, and the posterior pituitary is made out of nervous tissue. As a matter of fact, as you can kind of see, the posterior pituitary is connected to the hypothalamus, which is part of the brain, so it's nervous tissue. So I'm saying that the posterior pituitary is nervous tissue because it's just basically an extension of the hypothalamus region of the brain. But nevertheless, together they are considered one endocrine gland, the pituitary gland. They actually secrete entirely different hormones from one another. The anterior pituitary secretes a hormone called growth hormone, a hormone called prolactin, and several tropic hormones. Recall that tropic hormones are hormones that control other endocrine glands. The anterior pituitary secretes a tropic hormone that controls the thyroid gland. It secretes a tropic hormone that regulates the adrenal gland, and the anterior pituitary secretes a tropic hormone that regulate the gonads, which are the male and female reproductive organs, which are also endocrine glands. Yeah, so the anterior pituitary secretes three different tropic hormones to regulate thyroid gland, adrenal gland, and the gonads. The posterior pituitary, the back part of the pituitary gland, only secretes two hormones. One is called antidiuretic hormone, and the other is called oxytocin. So you can see that the pituitary gland as a whole secretes many hormones, and several of these hormones are tropic hormones, meaning that they control other endocrine glands. Because the pituitary secretes so many hormones, including several tropic hormones, some textbooks refer to the pituitary gland as the master gland of the body. I think that that's a little bit misleading, and here's why. Even though the pituitary gland secretes lots of hormones, and some of these hormones are tropic hormones which control other hormones, even though that's so, the pituitary gland itself is regulated by the hypothalamus. And so what I'm saying is the hypothalamus is actually in charge of the pituitary gland's secretion of hormones. And so it seems to me that if any gland was going to be called the master gland of the body, it really should be the hypothalamus. Now, how does the hypothalamus control the pituitary gland? Well, one way is by tropic hormones. These little blue dots that you see here. Didn't mean them to go away. There we go. These little blue dots that you see here are tropic hormones that the hypothalamus secretes to control the anterior pituitary gland. Now, the hypothalamus does not need to use tropic hormones to regulate the posterior pituitary gland because it's directly connected to it, right? You know, the posterior pituitary is nervous tissue that's connected to the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus can just use nervous system signaling to tell the posterior pituitary when to secrete its antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. But for the anterior pituitary gland, the hypothalamus uses tropic hormones to regulate the anterior pituitary. Okay, in the next part of this lecture, we are going to start discussing the effects of some of these hormones that come out of the pituitary. Now, in this lecture video, we're not going to cover the effects of all of these hormones because some of these hormones we're going to talk about in future lectures. For example, the pituitary hormone prolactin and the pituitary hormone oxytocin, those are related to the reproductive system, and so we will cover those when we get to the reproductive system. Okay, but one of the hormones that we are covering in this lecture video is growth hormone. So let's make the other ones vanish for a second. So growth hormone is a pituitary hormone, comes from the anterior pituitary. And so what does it do? Well, in just a few words, it causes growth. You know, its name makes sense. It's the major hormone that's involved in growth of our bodies. So all of us are born as tiny little newborn babies, but over the next couple of decades of our lives, we grow until we reach our final adult size, right? And when do we reach our adult size? Typically around puberty or a few years after puberty is when people stop growing, when they reach their final adult size. Okay, yeah, and growth hormone is the major hormone that causes that growth of our body from infant to final adult size. If you look at the definition in the lecture handout, it says growth hormone, sometimes abbreviated GH for short, a hormone that causes growth of bone and muscle, but interestingly, growth hormone actually decreases the amount of fatty tissue in our body. But for this lecture, we're going to be focusing on the ability of growth hormone to cause growth, and that's how it makes us get bigger. It causes the increase in our bones. In other words, it makes our skeletons get bigger and also our muscles get bigger. Now, I want to talk in a little bit more detail about how growth hormone causes growth, and for this, we're going to focus on its role in causing the bones to grow and causing the skeleton to grow. Okay, so just to review, growth hormone is secreted from the anterior pituitary. Oh yeah, now bear in mind, however, that the anterior pituitary, the secretion of hormones from the anterior pituitary is regulated by the hypothalamus. Remember that the hypothalamus secretes some tropic hormones which cause the anterior pituitary to secrete its hormones. So, as an example, the hypothalamus secretes some tropic hormones which cause the pituitary to secrete the growth hormone. So keep that in mind. But anyway, the pituitary secretes growth hormone, and like all hormones, growth hormone travels in the bloodstream. Okay, so how does it exactly cause the growth of our skeleton? How does it make your bones bigger? Well, so this is a cartoon of one of the bones in the body. Let's not worry about which bone it is. So bones contain some areas that are called epiphyseal plates. And interestingly, so these epiphyseal plates are the growth centers of the bone. They are the areas where bones get bigger. And interestingly, the epiphyseal plates are not bone tissue the way the rest of the bone is. The epiphyseal plates are actually cartilage tissue. And the way the bone growth works is this: those cartilage cells in the epiphyseal plates reproduce themselves to make more cartilage in the bone, but as quickly as more cartilage is made, there are cells in the bone tissue that convert that cartilage into new bone. So your bones grow by first having the cartilage grow, and then that new cartilage is converted to bone, and that's how your bones grow. Anyway, what growth hormone does is it causes the cartilage in those epiphyseal plates to reproduce itself. So here comes that growth hormone that we saw secreted from the pituitary there. And yeah, so the growth hormone makes the cartilage reproduce. And so as those cartilage cells reproduce themselves, more cartilage is made. But remember what I said, there are cells inside the bone tissue that convert that cartilage into bone, and so you end up with more bone tissue. Your bones grow. Okay, so that is the basic idea of how growth hormone causes the growth of our skeleton, the growth of our bones. Now, why does that growth stop when we reach puberty? Well, as it turns out, the hormones of puberty, the hormones that our body makes when we go through puberty, cause the cartilage in these epiphyseal plates to get converted to bone. And so, remember, growth hormone causes that cartilage to grow. Growth hormone can't cause any growth after puberty because there's no more cartilage there. That cartilage has been turned into bone tissue, and the growth hormone does not cause bone tissue to grow directly. Growth hormone causes the cartilage to reproduce. Anyway, so after puberty, your epiphyseal plates, the cartilage there, gets changed into bone, and then you have no more epiphyseal plates, so growth hormone can't cause any more growth after puberty. And interestingly, if you look at a person's bones after they've reached puberty, you can see the remnants of their epiphyseal plates inside their bones. Those are called epiphyseal lines. Okay, so the amount of growth hormone that the pituitary secretes as we are growing towards our adult height, the amount of growth hormone that the pituitary secretes is the major thing that determines a person's stature, and stature means how tall they are. And so people who don't attain a very high stature, the main reason why is that their anterior pituitary did not secrete very much growth hormone as they were growing. And people who obtain a tall stature, a high stature, the reason that they ended up tall is because their anterior pituitary secreted a lot of growth hormone as they were growing. Yeah, so again, the major thing that controls a person's stature, their final adult height, is the amount of growth hormone that their pituitary secreted during their growing years as they were growing. Okay, well, I want to discuss some disorders of growth hormone. And let's talk about oversecretion. So basically, as you might guess, oversecretion of growth hormone causes the person to get unusually tall. But there's kind of a nuance here. The growth hormone can only cause a person to get abnormally tall if the amounts of growth hormone are secreted before puberty, right? Because remember, after puberty, we lose our epiphyseal plates from our bones, and so growth hormone after puberty can't cause any more growth. But yes, if a person has excess amounts, oversecretion of growth hormone before puberty, when we still do have our epiphyseal plates in our bones, yeah, that will cause the person to grow to an abnormally tall height. And to give an example of that, a dramatic example, you see this very tall person on the left, even taller than a standard doorway. That's what happened to him. Before puberty, his pituitary gland was secreting way too much growth hormone, way more growth hormone than is normal. Incidentally, you don't have to know this gentleman's name, but his name was Robert Wadlow, and he reached a final height of 8 feet 6 inches. And just so you know, it wasn't because he came from a tall family. This is his father right there. His father was absolutely normal height. Okay, yeah, so Mr. Wadlow there, his anterior pituitary secreted way more than the normal amount of growth hormone before puberty, and so his bones grew a lot taller than a normal person's would. So here's kind of a thought question. If a person's pituitary secreted normal amounts of growth hormone before puberty, but then after puberty, their pituitary started secreting way more than normal amounts of growth hormone, would that person get taller? And the answer is no, because remember, after puberty, you lose your epiphyseal plates, which are the parts of the bones that respond to growth hormone. And so after puberty, no, it doesn't matter if you have total excess amounts of growth hormone. The growth hormone will not cause you to grow an inch more if you get the excess of growth hormone after puberty. Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention something. If a person has oversecretion of growth hormone before puberty, so they do end up with an abnormally tall stature, we say that that person has giantism. So Robert Wadlow here has giantism. But what I was about to say is, remember that if the excess of growth hormone is secreted after puberty, it's not going to cause giantism because the person's bones no longer have those epiphyseal plates. But there is an effect of excess growth hormone after puberty. It's not getting taller, but there is an effect. And what is that effect? Well, it causes growth of cartilage in other parts of the body. Because remember that growth hormone causes bones to grow actually by causing the cartilage and the epiphyseal plates to reproduce itself. So after puberty, you don't have epiphyseal plates in your bones, and so growth hormone doesn't cause your skeleton to get any larger, but you do have cartilage in other parts of your body that excess of growth hormone after puberty can cause to grow. And so there are effects of excess growth hormone after puberty from the cartilage growing in other parts of the body. That disease is called acromegaly. Acromegaly is where there's oversecretion of growth hormone after puberty. And so no increase in height, but it does cause growth of cartilage in other locations throughout the body. This woman that you see here has acromegaly, and so here she is before her pituitary started secreting excess amounts of growth hormone. And as it started secreting excess amounts of growth hormone, look at her jaw. You can see her jaw starts getting much larger than a normal jaw. And the reason for that is there's a lot of cartilage in the joints of the jaw. And so people have acromegaly, their jaws tend to get a lot larger than a normal person's jaw. There's also a lot of cartilage in the joints of our fingers. And so a person with acromegaly, their fingers start looking a lot more thicker than a normal person's fingers do. But anyway, just to remind you again, acromegaly is oversecretion of growth hormone after puberty, and it does not cause an increase in height. It causes these other effects like the growth of cartilage in the jaw and in the fingers. Okay, now you might be wondering, well, what would cause the pituitary to secrete excess amounts of a hormone, like excess amounts of growth hormone? Well, there's a part of the lecture handout that talks about endocrine system disorders. In other words, it talks about what causes the endocrine glands to oversecrete a hormone or undersecrete a hormone. Let's use the growth hormone as an example of what would cause oversecretion of the hormone. So remember that the growth hormone is secreted by the pituitary, by the anterior pituitary. The major cause of oversecretion of growth hormone or any hormone, the major cause of oversecretion of any hormone is a tumor in the endocrine gland. Tumors are cancer, and cancer is uncontrolled growth, cell growth in the body. But when the cancer arises in an endocrine gland, sometimes the tumor, the cancer cells, start overproducing the hormone from that endocrine gland. So what I'm saying is, if a person gets a tumor in their pituitary gland, the cancer cells of that tumor can start overproducing some of those pituitary hormones. And so, yeah, this is one possible cause of oversecretion of a hormone is a tumor in the endocrine gland that secretes that hormone. Or in this example, it's a tumor in the pituitary gland, and the cancer cells are oversecreting the pituitary hormone, growth hormone. Okay, so yeah, that's one cause of oversecretion of a hormone is a tumor in the gland that secretes the hormone. But there's kind of a subtlety here. Imagine that the person's pituitary gland does not have a tumor in it. So you might say, okay, so they would have normal amounts of growth hormone. Well, remember that the amount of hormones that the pituitary secretes is controlled by tropic hormones from the hypothalamus, right? Well, imagine that a person has a tumor in their hypothalamus, and that tumor in the hypothalamus starts over-secreting the tropic hormone that causes growth hormone secretion from the pituitary. And here we see that. So this is now excess amounts of the tropic hormone that causes the pituitary to release growth hormone. So what's going to be the effect on the amount of growth hormone secreted from the pituitary? The growth hormone is going to be over-secreted, right? So notice that it's not because the pituitary gland is not over-secreting growth hormone because there's a tumor in the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is over-secreting growth hormone because there is a tumor in the endocrine gland that controls the pituitary gland by secreting tropic hormones for the pituitary gland. And so, yeah, it's kind of tricky if a person has excess amounts of some hormone, like excess amounts of growth hormone. It may be because there's a tumor in the endocrine gland that secretes that hormone, or it could be that there's a tumor in the endocrine gland that controls that endocrine gland that secretes the hormone. So you can see, things can sometimes get a little confusing for doctors. If the doctors see that the person has too much of a certain hormone, the doctors don't know, at least they don't know initially, whether the tumor is in the gland that secretes that hormone, or like you see here, whether the tumor is in the gland that makes tropic hormones to cause that other gland to secrete the hormone. Anyway, so just in a nutshell, oversecretion of any hormone is generally caused by a tumor in some endocrine gland in the body. What about undersecretion of a hormone? Like what would cause, for instance, the pituitary gland to secrete very little, if any, growth hormone? Well, undersecretion of a hormone is generally caused by damage to the endocrine gland that secretes that hormone. So you might wonder, well, why would, what would cause an endocrine gland to be damaged? Well, in some cases it might be a birth defect. Maybe the person just doesn't have all the correct genes for the endocrine gland to secrete normal amounts of its hormone. In other cases, it might be an autoimmune disease. Autoimmune diseases are where the body's immune system gets confused and attacks some of the body's own tissues and organs. And so in some cases, an autoimmune disease, the immune system might attack an endocrine gland, and that could damage that endocrine gland enough to make that endocrine gland stop producing the hormones that it's supposed to. Okay, so yeah, oversecretion of a hormone generally caused by a tumor in an endocrine gland, undersecretion of a hormone generally caused by damage to an endocrine gland, perhaps a birth defect or perhaps an autoimmune disease. And let's now get back to talking more specifically about growth hormone. So remember that if the pituitary gland oversecretes growth hormone before puberty, the person gets taller than normal, and we call that giantism. If the person's pituitary gland oversecretes growth hormone after puberty, the person doesn't get taller, but there are other effects from cartilage growth in their jaws and fingers, and we call that disorder acromegaly. If the person's pituitary undersecreted growth hormone, if the person's pituitary undersecreted growth hormone before puberty, then the person's going to have abnormally low stature. They're going to be small, and that disorder is called dwarfism. Dwarfism is caused by undersecretion of growth hormone before puberty. And so let me give you a thought question. If a person's pituitary secreted normal amounts of growth hormone before puberty, but after puberty the person's pituitary stopped secreting growth hormone, would the person shrink? And the answer is no, because remember that the bones grow because of those epiphyseal plates, and after puberty there are no more epiphyseal plates in the bones, and so it doesn't matter if you have high levels of growth hormone or low levels of growth hormone or normal levels of growth hormone after puberty, your bones no longer have epiphyseal plates, and so your skeleton is not going to grow or shrink or change after puberty, because it's no longer, your skeleton is no longer being controlled by your growth hormone. Okay, that's the end of what we're going to talk about in regards to growth hormone. And of course, growth hormone, remember, secreted by the pituitary gland. We're now going to move a little bit downward in the body and talk about a different gland, actually two different glands, the thyroid gland and the parathyroid gland. And as you can see, these two glands are located together roughly at the base of the throat, roughly where the neck connects to the thorax. Okay, let me kind of give you my own drawing of the thyroid gland and the parathyroid gland. So the thyroid gland is the sort of peach-colored gland here that's in the shape of a butterfly, and the parathyroid glands are the spots on the wings of the butterfly. So I know that sounds slightly confusing. The thyroid gland is the butterfly-shaped gland you see here, and the parathyroid glands are what look like the spots on the wings of the butterfly. Okay, but even though the thyroid gland and the parathyroid glands are found together here at the base of the throat, they are considered separate glands from each other, and they secrete separate hormones. The thyroid gland secretes a hormone called calcitonin, and it also secretes a different hormone called thyroid hormone, whereas the parathyroid glands secrete only one hormone, and that hormone is called parathyroid hormone. So we're going to start off by discussing the thyroid gland, the butterfly-shaped gland here, and then after we're finished with the thyroid gland, then we'll start talking about the parathyroid glands. And in regards to the thyroid gland, we're going to start off talking about the thyroid hormone, and after we're finished talking about the thyroid hormone, then we'll talk about the calcitonin, that other hormone that also comes out of the thyroid gland. Okay, so the thyroid gland, one of the hormones it makes is called thyroid hormone. Let's talk about that. Here is a diagram of thyroid hormone. It's also known as T4 and thyroxine, and you don't have to memorize its exact structure. I'm not going to ask you to sketch out thyroid hormone's exact structure on a quiz or anything, but I do want you to notice that it contains iodine atoms. These little I's right here, here, and there are iodine atoms. T4 contains 4 iodine atoms. Now, that's kind of interesting because thyroid hormone is the only hormone that contains iodine atoms as part of its molecular structure. In fact, as far as I'm aware, thyroid hormone is the only molecule in the human body that contains iodine atoms at all. In other words, to make thyroid hormone, your body needs iodine in your diet, but that's the only reason you need iodine in your diet, is for your body to make this particular hormone. Anyway, so thyroid hormone, an iodine-containing hormone, and what exactly is its function? Well, thyroid hormone increases your body's basal metabolic rate, or BMR for short. And what is the BMR? Your basal metabolic rate, your BMR, is how many calories your body uses per hour. Now, calories is the same as energy. So your BMR is how much energy your body uses per hour, how many calories your body uses per hour. And your thyroid hormone controls what your BMR is, whether you have a high BMR or a low BMR. Now, we should ask, how exactly does thyroid hormone control our BMR? And the answer to that is thyroid hormone controls how fast your cells take in glucose for energy. So let me recap a few concepts here. You know that glucose is the blood sugar, and your cells take in glucose from the blood as a way of getting energy for themselves. We talked about this process. It's called cellular aerobic respiration. Your cells take in glucose sugar from the blood, and they use the energy in the glucose to provide energy for the cells to make ATP for themselves, right? That was the basis of cellular aerobic respiration. Anyway, so glucose is a fuel molecule that provides energy for your cells so that your cells can make ATP for themselves. Well, so when we talk about what a person's basal metabolic rate is, when we talk about how much energy their body is using per hour, what we're usually talking, or I should say the major thing we're talking about, is how much glucose their cells use per hour, right? Because glucose is energy, and the more energy, the more glucose your cells use per hour, the more energy your body uses per hour. Well, so let's relate this back to thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone tells the cells how much glucose they should take in per hour, and therefore thyroid hormone controls how much energy your body uses per hour. What your BMR is. Okay, now let me relate these concepts a little bit more to thyroid hormone. So let's imagine a person whose thyroid hormone levels were slightly higher than normal. So I'm not talking about a disorder yet. What I'm talking about is, imagine a person whose thyroid hormone levels were within the normal healthy range for thyroid hormone, but their levels were near the top of the healthy range. All right, so yeah, not a disease yet, just the high end of the normal range for thyroid hormone. And when I click the button here, you'll see the thyroid hormone speeds up a little bit. Here we go. Yeah, so imagine this person, they're still within the normal range of thyroid hormone, but they're at the high end of the normal range. So their thyroid gland is making a little more thyroid hormone than an average person. Well, so remember, the thyroid hormone tells the cells how much glucose to take in. So this person's cells would be taking in a little bit more glucose than an average person. So this person's cells would have a little bit more energy than an average person. And therefore, since we are made out of our cells, the person would have a little bit more energy than an average person. And so, yeah, what I'm saying is that a person who tends to have slightly higher than normal thyroid hormone levels will be a slightly higher energy person, right? Because their cells take in a little bit more glucose than normal, so their cells have more energy than normal, so that person just tends to be a little bit more active and energetic person. And furthermore, these people who have slightly higher than average levels of thyroid hormone, they tend to be a little bit slender. They tend to be a little bit more skinny than normal. And here's why. Because your body can convert glucose, blood sugar, into fat. But if the person's cells are consuming glucose at a fast rate, then the cells consume the glucose. They use up the glucose faster than your body can convert it into fat. So a person who has slightly higher than normal thyroid hormone levels, because their cells consume glucose at a faster than normal rate, their bodies just don't have time to convert that glucose into fat. So these people with slightly higher thyroid hormones tend to be a little bit slender, as well as being slightly higher energy. Now let's look at kind of the reverse scenario. So imagine a person whose thyroid hormone levels were a little bit low. In other words, their thyroid gland was secreting thyroid hormone slightly slower than a normal person's would. And so again, at this point, I'm not talking about a disorder or a disease of the thyroid. We're still imagining that the person's within the normal range of thyroid levels, but they're at the low end of the range. Okay, so that person, as you see illustrated here, their cells are going to take in glucose at a slightly lower rate than an average person. Therefore, that person's cells will have slightly lower energy levels than an average person. And since we are made out of our cells, that person's general energy levels would be a little bit slower than an average person's. So what would that person be like? Well, that person would be a little bit lower energy than an average person. And that person would also tend to put on weight a little bit more easily than an average person. And you see why. That because this person's cells are consuming glucose at a slower rate than an average person, the body has more time to convert that glucose into body fat. And so, yeah, this person would tend to put on weight a little bit more easily than an average person. All right, very good. So let's remember what controls the thyroid gland. So here's the thyroid gland over here, and we've been talking about this thyroid hormone, thyroxine, that the thyroid gland makes. But remember that the pituitary gland makes a tropic hormone that controls the thyroid gland's secretion of thyroid hormone. In other words, the pituitary gland makes a releasing hormone, a tropic hormone that makes the thyroid gland release the thyroid hormone. But remember that the pituitary gland, at least the anterior pituitary gland, is itself controlled by tropic hormones that come out of the hypothalamus, right? So yeah, hypothalamus makes tropic hormones which make the pituitary gland release its tropic hormones. And so one of those pituitary tropic hormones is a tropic hormone for the thyroid gland, which controls how much thyroid hormone the thyroid gland makes, right? Well, remember one of the concepts we mentioned earlier, that a tumor in an endocrine gland can cause that endocrine gland to start over-secreting a hormone. So we're going to now talk about over-secretion of thyroid hormone. What happens when the thyroid gland starts making too much thyroid hormone. We say that that person is hyperthyroid. But what I'm talking about now is, well, what might cause a person to become hyperthyroid? And, well, it could be a tumor in the... Oop, darn it, didn't want to go there yet. Go back. So what I was about to say is, what might cause a person to become hyperthyroid? Well, it could be a tumor in their thyroid gland, right? Because a tumor in a gland can make that gland over-secrete its hormones. But a person could also become hyperthyroid if they had a tumor in their pituitary gland, right? Because that tumor in the pituitary gland might cause the pituitary to secrete higher than normal levels of the tropic hormone that stimulates the thyroid gland. That would still cause the thyroid gland to over-secrete thyroxine if there was a tumor in the pituitary gland, making the pituitary secrete too much of this tropic hormone for the thyroid gland. But a person might have too much thyroid hormone also if there's a tumor in their hypothalamus, because that tumor might cause the hypothalamus to secrete too much of its tropic hormone, which would then overstimulate the pituitary to secrete too much of its tropic hormone, which would make the thyroid gland secrete too much thyroxine. So, one take-home message from all this is that if a person has elevated thyroid hormone levels, if a person has elevated thyroxine hormones, there are at least three possible causes in terms of tumors. It could be a tumor in the thyroid gland, it could be a tumor in the pituitary gland, or it could be a tumor in the hypothalamus. So I think you get a sense of how difficult it sometimes is for doctors to figure out what the cause of a hormone imbalance is. In this instance, you can see it could be a tumor in any one of these three glands, thyroid gland, pituitary, or hypothalamus, that would all lead to elevated levels of thyroid hormone. Okay, but so anyway, those are some possible causes of oversecretion of thyroid hormone. But let's go back to the disease itself. So if a person has oversecretion of thyroid hormone, we say that the person is hyperthyroid. And we also say that the person has Graves' disease. Graves' disease means hyperthyroid. It means oversecretion of thyroid hormone. And so what are the symptoms are going to be? Well, so that the thyroid hormone sets the rate at which the cells consume glucose, with the rate at which the cells use glucose and make energy for themselves. So a person who has Graves' disease, who is hyperthyroid, their cells are going to be taking in glucose at a really, really fast rate. And so that person's cells are going to just be brimming with energy, super high energy cells. And since we are made out of our cells, that person would be very, very high energy. And that typically manifests itself in people with Graves' disease as nervousness and fidgeting. They have so much energy, they're practically just sort of shaking and fidgeting all the time. A person who has Graves' disease, who is hyperthyroid, typically also has a high body temperature, because the rate at which your cells are consuming glucose is one of the things that controls your body temperature. People with Graves' disease also tend to lose weight, and I think you can figure out why that is, because remember that the body can convert glucose into body fat, but if a person is hyperthyroid, if they have a Graves' disease, their cells are consuming glucose so quickly that the body just doesn't have an opportunity to change that glucose into body fat. So yeah, people with Graves' disease tend to lose weight. Oh, and one last thing, people with Graves' disease, also one of the symptoms is large bulging eyes. And let's not get into the details of how Graves' disease leads to that, but it's definitely a symptom of Graves' disease is large bulging eyes. Okay, so anyway, Graves' disease is the same as being hyperthyroid. It's where the levels of thyroid hormone are significantly above the normal range for thyroid hormone. We're now going to talk about the opposite disease. It's called being hypothyroid, where there's undersecretion of thyroid hormone. The thyroid gland is making very little, if any, thyroid hormone. Earlier in this lecture, we talked about what might cause undersecretion of a hormone. And remember that it means damage to an endocrine gland. It might be a birth defect, or it might be some sort of autoimmune disease that has damaged the gland. So, if a person has damage to their thyroid gland, that might cause them to be hypothyroid, too little thyroid hormone. But it also might be something that has damaged the pituitary gland, so the pituitary gland is not able to secrete its tropic hormone to tell the thyroid to release thyroid hormone. Or it could be some sort of damage to the hypothalamus, so the hypothalamus is not able to secrete its tropic hormone to make the pituitary secrete its tropic hormone to make the thyroid secrete the thyroid hormone. So there could be damage to either the thyroid or the pituitary or the hypothalamus that might any of those might lead to a person being hypothyroid, undersecreting their thyroid hormone. Okay, so what would be the symptoms of a person who is hypothyroid? Well, we can kind of figure it out. Remember, the thyroid hormone controls how fast the person's cells are consuming glucose. And so a person who is hypothyroid, their cells are going to be consuming very, very little glucose. And so the person's cells are going to be low in energy. And since we are made out of our cells, this hypothyroid person is going to be a low energy person, just not have very much energy to do any activities. And they also tend to be apathetic. Apathy means that you're just not interested in doing things. So I guess that when the person is just low energy, nothing sounds is worth expending energy over. And so people who are hypothyroid, they seem to not care. They just seem to have apathy a lot of the time. They tend to have low body temperature, which again makes sense because remember, one of the things that sets your body temperature is how fast your cells are consuming glucose. And another thing with people who are hypothyroid, they tend to gain weight easily. And again, we can understand that because remember that the body can convert blood glucose into body fat. So if a person is hypothyroid, their cells are not consuming their blood glucose, or at least not consuming it very much. And so the body has time to convert that blood glucose into body fat. So hypothyroid people tend to put on weight very easily. Now, there's some interesting extra symptoms of being hypothyroid in infants and young people. If an infant or a very young person is hypothyroid, they have all of these symptoms that I've already mentioned. They tend to gain weight easily. They tend to be low body temperature. They tend to be low energy. But in addition, if the person who is hypothyroid is an infant or a very young person, they also end up with short stature. They also end up physically being small. And here's the reason for that. Remember that growth hormone is the major hormone that controls our stature, how tall we get. But for growth hormone to cause us to grow, the body has to have normal levels of thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone permits growth hormone to have its growth effects. So if a young person is hypothyroid, they don't have enough thyroid hormone to permit growth hormone to cause the growth of their body. And so people who are young kids who are hypothyroid end up extremely short. And you can see especially it's affected, the low thyroid hormone levels have especially affected the growth of the legs. This young person's legs are incredibly smaller than they should be for their body size. Yeah, so infants and young people who are hypothyroid will have stunted growth, and they also end up with some mental retardation. Proper development of the brain relies on proper levels of thyroid hormones when we are infants and young people. And those symptoms, stunted growth and mental retardation because of low thyroid hormone levels, is called cretinism. And so this child you see here has cretinism. One more thing about being hypothyroid. So, I mentioned one possible cause of hypothyroid being that there might be damage to the thyroid gland or the pituitary gland or the hypothalamus. Another thing that can cause hypothyroid is not getting enough iodine in the diet. Recall that thyroid hormone contains iodine atoms, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's why they call it T4, because it has 4 iodine atoms. And so if you're not getting enough iodine in your diet, your body just can't make the thyroid hormone because you don't have enough iodine atoms. And so you can end up being hypothyroid because of lack of iodine in your diet. Now, just as a general knowledge question, does anybody know where we get iodine in our diet? Or maybe what I should say is what common product that you buy at the grocery store has iodine added to it to make sure that you get enough iodine in your diet? And the answer is table salt. If you look at the table salt that you buy in the grocery store, almost certainly it will say iodinated or iodine added salt. Yeah, so the government has some regulations in place that the people who make salt add a little bit of iodine to the salt, just to make sure that all of us don't end up with an iodine deficiency. If a person somehow did end up with an iodine deficiency, despite the fact that the government makes sure that we get iodine added to our salt, but if a person did end up with an iodine deficiency, then, as I said, their thyroid gland can't make the proper amounts of thyroid hormone, so that person would end up hypothyroid. If that's the cause of the person being hypothyroid, that they don't have enough iodine in their diet, the thyroid gland will start to swell up. And so you can see this person right here, a very swollen thyroid gland. That enlarged thyroid gland, because of lack of iodine in the diet, is called a goiter. So this person has a goiter. And having a goiter, like I say, is a symptom of having low iodine in the diet. Now, because in the United States and other developed countries, the government mandates that iodine is added to the salt, very few people in the United States and developed countries end up with goiters. But in some developing nations, some of the poorer nations, they don't have such a regulation, and so some of their citizens, more of their citizens, can end up with these goiters, with these enlarged thyroid glands from iodine deficiency. Okay, let's get back to this figure that we saw a few minutes ago. Remember, the sort of peach-colored butterfly-shaped thing is the thyroid gland, and the smaller glands that look like the spots on the wings of the butterfly are the parathyroid glands. So we've been talking about the thyroid gland, and it secretes 2 hormones. One hormone is called calcitonin, and the other hormone that the thyroid secretes is called thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone has a couple of other names. It's also called thyroxine or T4. And just to do a brief recap of thyroid hormone, well, it's secreted by the thyroid, and it controls the basal metabolic rate of the body, the BMR of the body, which is how many calories the body uses per hour. And how it controls that is the thyroid hormone controls the rate at which your cells take in glucose from the blood, how much glucose your body consumes per hour. Okay, so we're now going to move on to the other hormones on this chart. So there's calcitonin, this other hormone that the thyroid secretes, and there is parathyroid hormone, this hormone that the parathyroid glands secrete. Well, as it turns out, both of those hormones, the calcitonin from the thyroid gland and the parathyroid hormone from the parathyroids, both of those are involved in controlling the levels of calcium ions in your blood. And so let's now talk about the calcium ions in the blood. Okay. Oh yeah. So here's my new drawing of the thyroid gland there and the parathyroids. Okay. So your blood has a certain concentration of calcium ions in it. And like all internal conditions of the body, it has a certain healthy homeostatic set point range. In other words, there's a certain concentration of calcium ions in your blood that is the correct and normal and healthy concentration of calcium ions in the blood. And you will start to have problems. You will start to have disorders if your calcium levels in the blood are too high or too low. Just to give an example, if your blood calcium levels get too low, that can affect things like the proper beating of your heart or the proper contraction of your voluntary muscles. Anyway, so the point I'm making right now is that there's a certain correct, healthy concentration of calcium ions in the blood. And as we'll see here in a few minutes, the calcitonin hormone from the thyroid gland and also the parathyroid hormone secreted from the parathyroid glands are what control your blood calcium levels. Those are the hormones that keep you at the proper homeostatic set point for calcium ions in the blood. Okay, so let's imagine, just as a scenario here, that your blood calcium levels went above their normal range. Now, why would this happen? Well, maybe you went on a high calcium diet for some reason. Maybe you decided to drink milk for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Yeah, so your blood levels of calcium would get above their normal homeostatic set point range. Well, your body wants to lower the calcium ions in the blood back into their normal range, and it's going to use the bones to do that. Your bones, remember, have calcium ions as part of their extracellular matrix, and your bones can act as kind of a reservoir for calcium ions. You know, if you have too much water, you can put it into a reservoir to hold the water, so to speak. Yeah, so if your blood levels of calcium are above the normal homeostatic set point, your bones can take in some of that calcium and use that calcium to give themselves a little bit more extracellular matrix, thus removing calcium ions from the blood. But the thing is, your bone cells need to be told that it's time to take in calcium from the blood and give themselves a little bit more extracellular matrix. And that's what the hormone calcitonin does. The calcitonin is the hormone it's secreted by your thyroid gland when your blood calcium levels are too high. Elevated calcium levels in the blood causes the thyroid gland to secrete calcitonin hormone, and calcitonin hormone, its target organs are the bones, and it tells the cells of the bones, hey, take in calcium from the blood. We need to lower the blood's calcium levels. And so that's what the bone cells do when they receive calcitonin hormone. They start taking in calcium from the blood, and as I said, they use it to construct for themselves a little bit more extracellular matrix, and so your bones get a little bit denser. Now, this is not the type of thing that you would be able to feel. Like, you wouldn't physically feel that your skeleton has suddenly gotten heavier and denser. It's a very small amount of increased bone density, but nevertheless, it's enough to cause the calcium ions in the blood to be brought back down into their normal level. Yeah, so in your lecture handout, it summarizes that if you have high calcium levels in the blood, then the thyroid secretes more calcitonin hormone, and that causes the bone cells to construct more bone extracellular matrix, which lowers your calcium ions back down to their normal homeostatic set point range. Okay, now let's imagine the opposite scenario. Let's imagine that your blood calcium ion levels went below their normal homeostatic set point range. Why would that happen? Well, maybe you went on a low calcium diet. Maybe you decided to not drink any dairy products or other sources of calcium at all. Well, so this is not a healthy situation, so your body wants to add calcium ions into the blood now to get your blood back into the normal homeostatic set point range, right? Well, remember, the bones are the reservoir for calcium, and you can get water out of a reservoir if you need water. So what I'm saying is, if your blood levels of calcium are low, the bone cells can break down a little bit of the extracellular matrix, which releases calcium ions out of the bone into the blood. But your bone cells need to be told when it's time to break down some of the bone extracellular matrix to put calcium ions in the blood, and that's what the parathyroid hormone does. In other words, if your blood calcium levels are low, then the parathyroid starts secreting parathyroid hormone, and the bones are the target organs of parathyroid hormone. The parathyroid hormone causes the bone cells to start breaking down the extracellular matrix, which causes secretion of calcium ions out of the bones into the blood. And notice that restored the blood to its normal calcium levels, raising the blood calcium levels back to their normal levels. This would make the bones density slightly less, right? Because the bones are giving up some of their calcium. And again, it wouldn't be the type of thing that you would physically feel. You wouldn't feel that your skeleton was getting lighter or less dense, unless this went on for years. If for years and years and years and years you were not getting enough calcium in your diet, and so for years and years and years your parathyroids were secreting parathyroid hormone, making your bone break down the extracellular matrix, then your bones would start to lose significant amounts of calcium, and so your bone density would decrease, and you would have fragile bones. And that disorder is called osteoporosis. Osteoporosis is generally caused by years and years of low calcium levels in the diet, and it makes the bones thin and fragile because the bones have been dissolving their extracellular matrix to put calcium ions into the blood. Okay, so I guess the major message of what we just talked about for the last few minutes is that there are two hormones that work antagonistically to keep your blood's calcium levels within the proper range, and those two hormones are calcitonin hormone from the thyroid gland and parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid glands. The calcitonin hormone decreases your blood calcium if the blood calcium gets too high, and the parathyroid hormone increases your blood calcium if the blood calcium gets too low. There's a nice figure on the next page that I stole. Oh, actually, we're not there yet. This shows normal, healthy bone extracellular matrix. Now, I realize there's some kind of holes there, but some holes in the extracellular matrix of the bone are normal and healthy. Anyway, so this is healthy bone. This is bone from a person who has osteoporosis. And if you look closely, you see that the bone extracellular matrix is cratered with all these little tiny holes. And you can just visually see this person's bones are going to be a lot more fragile. Anyway, so this is osteoporosis, and it comes from years and years and years of low calcium in the diet because the bones are breaking down their extracellular matrix to provide calcium for the blood. Anyway, what I was about to say is, here's a figure that summarizes the calcitonin and parathyroid hormone antagonistic effects on blood calcium levels. The way they did this diagram, this looks like sort of a teeter-totter that's in balance, right? And they're using that to symbolize the correct homeostatic healthy range of calcium ions in the blood. And you don't have to memorize this range, but in case you're curious, the correct homeostatic healthy range of calcium ions in the blood is 9 to 11 milligrams of calcium per 100 milliliters of blood. And like I say, I'm not going to test you on that, but that's what the healthy range for calcium is. Okay, so what they're showing here is if your blood levels of calcium become imbalanced in that they're above the normal levels of calcium, then that stimulates the thyroid gland to secrete calcitonin hormone. Bones are the target organ of calcitonin hormone. And the calcitonin causes the bone cells to remove calcium ions from the blood, make more extracellular matrix, and that removing of the calcium ions from the blood brings you back into balance, the correct homeostatic set point for calcium ions. If your blood calcium ions becomes imbalanced in a way that's less than the normal range, then that stimulates your parathyroid glands to secrete parathyroid hormone, whose target organs are also the bones, and it actually stimulates some cells that break down the bone extracellular matrix to secrete calcium ions into the blood, and that adds calcium ions to the blood and brings you back into balance. Okay, that's all we're going to cover about the thyroid and parathyroid glands for now. And of course, remember, those are located right there at the base of the throat, where the neck hits the torso. The next endocrine gland, or should say glands, that we're going to discuss are the adrenal glands, which you can see are sitting right on top of the kidneys. As a matter of fact, let's sort of zoom in on the adrenal glands a little bit. Okay, yeah, so here's all of us have a pair of kidneys, a left kidney and a right kidney, and sitting on top of each kidney is an adrenal gland. So you have two adrenal glands. You have a left adrenal gland and a right adrenal gland. And incidentally, that's where the word adrenal comes from. Ad means on, and renal means kidney, so the name adrenal literally means on the kidneys. Now, the kidneys make urine. But the adrenal glands have nothing to do with that. The adrenal glands are entirely separate organs. They don't make urine. They don't store urine. They're endocrine glands. They secrete hormones. They have nothing to do with urine. Okay, now each adrenal gland is made up of two different parts, and to see the two different parts, imagine that we're going to cut this adrenal gland in two so we can see the inside of it. So here it is, and you can visually see, there's two parts. There's two different tissues in the adrenal gland. The outer portion of the adrenal gland is called the adrenal cortex, and the inner region of the adrenal gland is called the adrenal medulla. Medulla means middle. And they are different tissues. The adrenal cortex is epithelial tissue, and the adrenal medulla is nervous tissue, and they secrete different hormones from each other. Okay, so we're going to start off talking about the adrenal cortex and the hormones that it secretes, and then after we're done talking about the adrenal cortex and its hormones, then we will talk about the adrenal medulla and its hormones. Okay, so what hormones does the adrenal cortex secrete? Well, here's kind of a zoomed out view. And the two major hormones that the adrenal cortex secretes are a hormone called aldosterone, and another hormone called, and another family of hormones called the glucocorticoids. I know this says cortisol, but cortisol is one of the glucocorticoid molecules. Yeah, so the major hormones that come out of the adrenal cortex, aldosterone and the glucocorticoids. Now, those are the major ones that the adrenal cortex secretes. In addition to those, the adrenal cortex also secretes tiny amounts of the male hormone testosterone and the female hormone estrogen. So let me give you another view of some of these hormones. Actually, I guess I was going to mention what these ones do. So aldosterone is used to help regulate the sodium levels in your blood. In other words, aldosterone hormone helps keep the sodium concentration in your blood in the right homeostatic, healthy set point range. And the glucocorticoids, they help your body respond to what we call long-term stress. Now, I'll mention a few more about these effects in just a moment, but what I was starting to mention is, in addition to these two major hormones, the adrenal cortex also secretes very small amounts of testosterone and estrogen. So this actually shows pretty much all the hormones that the adrenal cortex secretes. Cortisol and other glucocorticoids, aldosterone, and the male hormone testosterone, and the female hormone estrogen. Now let me mention about something, the functions of these. So aldosterone, I guess I just mentioned that it helps your body regulate the proper sodium levels of the blood. We're not going to talk too much about aldosterone in this lecture. When we do the urinary system later on in the semester, I'll have more to say about aldosterone. And we're also not going to talk too much about the sex hormones that the adrenal cortex secretes, the testosterone and the estrogen. We'll cover more about those hormones when we do the reproductive system later on in the semester. But before I leave the testosterone and estrogen, I just want to mention a couple things about them. So in the major source of testosterone hormone is the testicles, and only males have testicles. Only anatomical males have testicles. So you would think that the anatomical females would have no testosterone, but that's not true because no matter if you're a male or female, you have adrenal glands, and the adrenal cortex secretes small amounts of testosterone. So no matter if you're an anatomical male or anatomical female, you're going to have some testosterone in you, and at least for females, the source of that testosterone is the adrenal cortex. And kind of similarly, estrogen is secreted from the female reproductive organs, from the ovaries. And males, anatomical males, don't have ovaries, so at first you might think, well, males don't have any estrogen, but again, that's not true thanks to the adrenal glands, because the adrenal glands in both sexes secrete some estrogen. Males do have small amounts of estrogen in them. So I don't know, I think it's kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Democratic or equalizing. It doesn't matter if you're an anatomical male or an anatomical female. You will have some testosterone in you and you will have some estrogen in you. It doesn't matter who you are, you have some of the male hormone in you and you have some of the female hormone in you. Okay, so that's really all I'm going to say about the adrenal cortex secreting small amounts of testosterone and estrogen. And like I said, we're not going to talk about aldosterone anymore in this lecture. So the rest of this lecture on the adrenal cortex, we're going to focus just on this one family of hormones, the glucocorticoids. Oh, actually, one more thing before we dive into the glucocorticoids. So notice that all of these hormones that are secreted by the adrenal cortex are steroid hormones, right? Remember, a steroid is any molecule that has whose backbone is these four fused rings of carbon. So just, I don't know, bear that in mind or make that something you're learning from today's lectures, that all of the hormones that are secreted by the adrenal cortex are steroid hormones. Okay, very good. So getting back to the major hormones that the adrenal cortex secretes, aldosterone to regulate sodium levels and the glucocorticoids to regulate long-term stress. Okay, so we're going to focus on the glucocorticoids. The glucocorticoids are a family of molecules, highly related molecules, and cortisol and cortisone are the two major glucocorticoids that the adrenal cortex secretes. And so, like I said, that they help you through periods of long-term stress. The function of these glucocorticoids is to assist you through periods of long-term stress. Now, you might be wondering, what exactly is long-term stress? Well, the people who study stress subdivide it into two types: short-term stress and long-term stress. And in a nutshell, short-term stress is something that you see as an immediate threat to your survival. Long-term stress are more things that you're worried about but are not going to kill you. So it'll be a little bit more clear. Short-term stress, if some evil person was chasing you and threatening to beat you up or harm you physically in some way, or you get in a car accident and you're worried that you may have died or something like that, that would be a short-term stress, what you perceive as an immediate threat to your life and health. Long-term stresses, those are things that you don't think are going to kill you, but that you worry about. For instance, maybe you have a bunch of bills stacking up and you don't have enough money to pay them. That would be a long-term stress. You don't think you're going to die if you don't pay those bills, but it's something you worry about. Or if exams are coming up here at Hormonal and you haven't had time to study enough, that would be a long-term stress. Again, it's something you worry about, but you don't feel it's going to actually kill you. Okay, so what I'm saying is the adrenal cortex secretes glucocorticoids in response to long-term stress. The goal of the glucocorticoid hormones is to help you get through these periods of long-term stress. Now, how exactly do the glucocorticoids help you get through these periods of long-term stress? And the shorter answer is they boost your blood glucose levels. It kind of makes sense, right? To see you through these periods of long-term stress, you might need a little extra blood sugar to give you a little extra energy. Like you might need a little extra blood sugar to help you study for more hours if what's worrying you is you're doing well on midterms, or you might need a little extra blood sugar to work a few extra shifts if what you're worrying you is you don't have enough money to pay your bills. So the glucocorticoids, they help you through long-term stress by boosting your blood sugar levels. Let's see, responses to long-term stress for the glucocorticoids. Here we go. So the glucocorticoids, they help you get through periods of long-term stress by boosting your blood sugar levels. How do they boost your blood sugar levels? Well, that's kind of interesting. What they do is the glucocorticoids cause your body to break down small amounts of its protein and small amounts of its fats. And the body is able to convert molecules like proteins and fats into glucose. There's this process called gluconeogenesis where the body can make glucose out of other molecules like proteins and fats. Yeah, so to help you through those periods of long-term stress, the glucocorticoids causes your body to break down proteins and fats and convert them into glucose, and then that glucose goes into your bloodstream, boosts your blood sugar levels, and that gives you a little bit of extra energy to see you through these periods of long-term stress. And incidentally, this family of molecules, these hormones, are the glucocorticoids. The name makes a little sense. The gluco part because they boost your blood glucose. The corti because they come from the adrenal cortex, and the oids because they're steroid molecules. I think that's kind of cool. The name of the hormone tells you what it boosts, where it comes from, and what type of hormone it is, a steroid hormone. So let me just kind of pause here and say, these functions of the glucocorticoids, to me, they make sense in helping you through long-term stress, right? To help you through long-term stress, you might need some extra blood sugar, and to give you that blood sugar, you have to break down some other molecules, the proteins and fats. And so, yeah, this makes sense. Well, the reason I'm pointing that out is there's another function of the glucocorticoids, which to me never made any sense in terms of helping you through long-term stress. The glucocorticoids suppress your immune system. They make your immune system weaker. Now, what always confused me about that is the purpose of the glucocorticoids is to help you through periods of long-term stress. So how does having a weaker immune system help you through a stressful situation? Well, it wouldn't, right? If your immune system has been weakened, you're more likely to catch a cold or a flu, and that's not going to help you through the stressful period. And so, yeah, this part just never made any sense to me. Why do the glucocorticoids suppress your immune system? That's not going to help you through the stress. Well, I don't know what the answer to that is. That's always been kind of a mystery to me. And yet it is a fact. That is one of the effects of glucocorticoids, is to suppress your immune system, decrease your immune system. Now, if there's kind of a golden lining to that aspect of the actions of glucocorticoids, if there's a good thing that relates to them suppressing the immune system, is this: doctors can give glucocorticoids to a patient if that patient would benefit from having their immune system suppressed. And you might think, well, why would it ever be good to suppress the immune system? Well, there are times when the immune system is causing inflammation and other activities that are actually not good for us. So here's an example. I think this person was stung by a jellyfish or something, but you can see that their skin is all inflamed, right? And that's not going to be a very comfortable situation for the person. Well, you can buy in drugstores, you can buy over-the-counter medicines that are made out of cortisone and cortisol, the glucocorticoids, and you can just smear these on your skin, and it decreases the inflammation, it decreases the immune response, and takes away the itching and the soreness of whatever is causing your skin to get inflamed. Or there's more serious things, and one example is some people have a painful condition in the soles of their feet called plantar fasciitis, which is caused by inflammation of the fascia inside the soles of the feet. Doctors can give injections of glucocorticoids into the sole of the foot to reduce the inflammation, and that reduces the pain of the plantar fasciitis. Or another example, people can have painful joints because they're swelling in the joint, like some types of arthritis fit that definition. And so the doctors, in extreme cases, can inject glucocorticoids into the painful joint to reduce the inflammation, and that takes away the pain. Yeah, so what I'm saying is that if there is a golden lining to the fact that glucocorticoids suppress the immune system, it's that the doctors can give, they give synthetic glucocorticoids, but the point is they give glucocorticoids as a way of decreasing the patient's immune system when that is medicinally beneficial. Okay, we're going to finish off our discussion of the glucocorticoids by talking about diseases that relate to the oversecretion of the glucocorticoids and undersecretion of the glucocorticoids. Okay, Cushing syndrome is is the disease where the adrenal cortex is over-secreting glucocorticoids. So let's first talk about Cushing syndrome, oversecretion. So here we see this picture of the adrenal gland. Of course, remember the outer part of it that they're showing in yellow is the adrenal cortex that makes the glucocorticoids. But remember that the pituitary gland makes a tropic hormone that causes the adrenal gland to secrete its glucocorticoids. This tropic hormone that you see coming out of the pituitary is what makes the adrenal cortex secrete the glucocorticoids. And remember that the secretion of hormones from the pituitary is itself regulated by tropic hormones that are secreted by the hypothalamus. And so, oh yeah, and also remember, of course, that oversecretion of any hormone is usually caused by a tumor in an endocrine gland. Well, so if the doctors see that a person has Cushing syndrome, has abnormally high levels of the glucocorticoids, where is the tumor? Well, the tumor might be in the adrenal gland. That would make sense because that's the adrenal gland is what makes the glucocorticoids. But remember, the tumor might also be in the pituitary gland because the pituitary gland secretes the tropic hormones that make the adrenal gland secrete the glucocorticoids. So if there were a tumor in the pituitary gland could secrete too much of that tropic hormone, and therefore that would also cause abnormally high levels of glucocorticoids. But the problem also might be a tumor in the hypothalamus because that might cause the hypothalamus to secrete too much of the tropic hormone that causes the pituitary to secrete its tropic hormone that causes the adrenal to secrete its glucocorticoids. Yeah, so it could be a tumor in the hypothalamus or in the pituitary gland or in the adrenal gland itself. But I guess the important point is that Cushing syndrome is oversecretion of glucocorticoids, and yeah, there's a number of glands that might be responsible for the oversecretion. Anyway, so what are the symptoms of Cushing syndrome? Well, remember that the glucocorticoids boost blood sugar. So people who have Cushing syndrome are going to have higher than normal blood sugar levels. Now, but remember that the glucocorticoids break down proteins and fats in the body to make the extra glucose out of. The glucocorticoids cause proteins and fats to be broken down so the body can do gluconeogenesis to make that extra blood sugar. So people who have Cushing syndrome, who oversecrete their glucocorticoids, they have high blood sugar, but they tend to lose proteins in their bodies. Their proteins are broken down. Now, muscles serve as a major storehouse for the proteins in your body. So people with Cushing syndrome tend to have muscle degeneration as the muscles are losing protein to convert it into glucose. Generally, the people also will lose fats because fats are also broken down to make the glucose under the influence of glucocorticoids. But there's kind of an interesting subtlety. Even though a person with Cushing syndrome is in general losing muscle and body fat, for some reason that's not really well understood. People with Cushing syndrome gain some fat tissue, typically here at the base of the neck or in their face. And like I said, that's not really well understood because in general, glucocorticoids cause a breakdown of fats and muscles. And yet for some strange reason, the exception is the back of the neck and along the face. So people with Cushing syndrome start to get extra fatty deposits in their neck and in their face. And this bump right here is sometimes called the buffalo hump. That particular symptom of oversecretion of glucocorticoids, that lump of fat right there, is called the buffalo hump. It's a symptom of it's a sign of Cushing syndrome. And something else that's interesting about Cushing syndrome. So, with Cushing syndrome, the adrenal cortex is oversecreting the hormone, the glucocorticoid hormones. But remember that the adrenal cortex also makes small amounts of testosterone. And for people with Cushing syndrome, it's not just the glucocorticoids, but the testosterone that's secreted from the adrenal cortex also gets boosted. In males, who already have lots and lots of testosterone, the increase in testosterone, if they have Cushing syndrome, is not significant. It doesn't really cause any real changes to them since they have so much testosterone already from their testicles. But females have usually very, very little testosterone. And so if a female gets Cushing syndrome, and so she gets more testosterone than she usually does, she might start to see some effects of the testosterone. For instance, females who have extra high testosterone levels because they have Cushing syndrome will sometimes get some male facial hair. They might get beginnings of a mustache or a beard growing on their face because of the extra testosterone. And so it turns out that's oftentimes what brings a female into the doctor's office. You know, she suddenly notices she's having hair growing on her upper lip or on her chin, and so you go to the doctor and says, well, this isn't normal, I'm growing a mustache and a beard. And then the doctor says, the doctor is wise, then says, okay, let's check your glucocorticoid levels because it might be that you have Cushing syndrome. Anyway, so Cushing syndrome is oversecretion of the glucocorticoids, causes high blood sugar, muscle degeneration, generally loss of body fat also, but there are these deposits of fats along the back of the neck and the face, one on the back of the neck being called the buffalo hump. Okay, and there's another disorder that we're going to talk about that's sort of the opposite of Cushing syndrome. So Cushing syndrome is oversecretion of the glucocorticoids. This other disease is called Addison's disease, and it's undersecretion of the glucocorticoids and all the other steroid hormones from the adrenal cortex. Yes, so the adrenal cortex secretes not only glucocorticoids, but also aldosterone, too, that regulates the sodium balance. And so people with Addison's disease, the secretion of all their adrenal cortex hormones is decreased almost to nil. So what is the effect on that? Well, without that aldosterone to help regulate their blood sodium levels are way out of balance. They can have way too much sodium or way too little sodium. And without the glucocorticoids to help boost the blood sugar can get extremely low. And because of the imbalance in the sodium and the blood sugar, they can also end up dehydrated. It affects how much water, the sodium and the glucose in your blood can affect how much water your body loses when you urinate from the kidneys. And so people with Addison's disease also can get dehydrated, and this can lead to weakness. Now, if there's a silver lining to Addison's disease, it's this: it's very treatable. Doctors can simply inject the person with aldosterone and the glucocorticoids, and that essentially treats the disease. So with proper treatment, it's essentially symptom-free. And here's a little-known fact. President John Kennedy had Addison's disease, and so he received regular injections of the adrenal cortex hormones, and no one in the public knew he had Addison's disease because it was so treatable. Okay, so that wraps it up for what we're going to talk about in regard to the adrenal cortex. So just to recap, the adrenal cortex makes several steroid hormones, aldosterone, which regulates sodium levels, but what we focused on was the glucocorticoids, which are there to help you through periods of long-term stress. And what the glucocorticoids do is break down proteins and fats and to boost your blood sugar, but the glucocorticoids also suppress your immune system. Okay, that is what we're going to cover about long-term stress. And remember, the long-term stress, of course, are the things that you worry about, like unpaid bills or midterms coming up or something like that. Those are things that you worry about, but you don't perceive they're going to kill you or injure you. Well, we're now going to focus on short-term stress. Short-term stress is the opposite of long-term stress. Short-term stress are things that you do perceive as an immediate threat to your life or your health, things that you perceive could potentially kill you or injure you. All right, so getting back to the adrenal gland, here it is. So remember that the adrenal gland has two parts: the adrenal cortex on the outside, which is made out of epithelial tissue, and the adrenal medulla, the part on the inside of the adrenal gland, which is made out of nervous tissue. Okay, so remember that the adrenal cortex is the part that helps you through periods of long-term stress by secreting glucocorticoids. The adrenal medulla is the thing that helps you through periods of short-term stress. The adrenal medulla secretes substances that in response to short-term stress that help you get through these periods of short-term stress. Okay, so what are these substances? Well, they are one of them is epinephrine, and the other is norepinephrine. And I'll talk more about what these secreted substances are in a moment. Okay, but I think I mentioned the adrenal medulla is nervous tissue, like you see here. These are supposed to be little neurons, and yeah, it's the neurons of the adrenal medulla that secrete the epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now, the nervous tissue of the adrenal medulla is connected to, is part of the body's sympathetic division of the nervous system. So we talked about the sympathetic division of the nervous system when we did the lecture on the nervous system. Remember that the sympathetic division of the nervous system gets more active when you're angry or frightened. If something you feel is a threat to you, so you get angry or frightened, and your sympathetic division neurons get more active. And so when that happens, when these sympathetic division neurons get more active, they stimulate these neurons here in the adrenal medulla to start secreting the epinephrine and the norepinephrine. Okay, and so what are these substances, the epinephrine and the norepinephrine? Well, so again, remember that the goal of these substances is to help you through these periods of short-term stress. Oh, and I should mention that, the short-term stress that we're talking about, these things that you perceive as potentially killing you or injuring you, your response to it, the secretion of the epinephrine and the norepinephrine, is sometimes called your fight or flight response, because something is you perceive it as a threat, so you're either going to physically fight it or run away from it. So it's your fight or flight response. Yeah, so these substances are your fight or the secretion of these two substances is your fight or flight response. Okay, so what are they? Well, epinephrine is a hormone, and it used to be called adrenaline. So epinephrine is the same as adrenaline, and we've been familiar with that. Something frightens us, we say, "Whoa, I got an adrenaline rush when that happened." Well, that's epinephrine is adrenaline. So you already associate the secretion of epinephrine with something that makes you frightened, right? So norepinephrine is not technically a hormone; it's actually a neurotransmitter. We talked about it when we covered the nervous system. It's secreted by the postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic division, and that's actually what these neurons of the adrenal medulla are. They are the postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic division. Anyway, so yeah, when you're angry or frightened, your sympathetic division neurons get more active, and that causes these neurons here in the adrenal medulla to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. Now, there's something kind of unusual there. So epinephrine is a hormone. It's the same as the hormone adrenaline, and so hormones get secreted into the bloodstream. That's what we expect out of hormones. But norepinephrine, when we've been talking about it in the context of the nervous system, we said it was a neurotransmitter, right? And so it's a bit unusual for a neurotransmitter to be secreted into the bloodstream. Normally, neurotransmitters are secreted into a synapse, right? Not into the bloodstream. So norepinephrine has this weird sort of two-part existence. It is a neurotransmitter, but it can also act as a hormone. It can also be secreted into the bloodstream to act as a hormone as part of the fight or flight response. And you might remember from our discussion of the nervous system that norepinephrine and epinephrine are almost have almost the exact same molecular structure. You know, they're you can see here they're pretty much carbon copies of each other, and there's a slight difference on what's attached to this nitrogen atom right there. But the major point is they're almost identical molecules, and they fit into the same receptors. So epinephrine and norepinephrine both fit into a family of receptors called the adrenergic receptors. So when your body, when the adrenal medulla secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream, they cause the same effects because they bind to the same receptors in the body. Oh yeah, and so what are those effects? Well, I listed them here. Responses to short-term stress, that happen because of the epinephrine and norepinephrine that get secreted from the adrenal medulla. Increased heart rate, in other words, when epinephrine and norepinephrine bind to the adrenergic receptors of the heart, that causes the heart to beat faster and stronger. The epinephrine and norepinephrine cause the bronchioles to dilate. Bronchioles are airways, so it makes your airways get larger so you can bring more oxygen into your blood. The blood vessels in your muscles and your heart and your lungs dilate, so you get larger blood vessels to help circulate more blood. And so, all of these make sense because, you have this fight or flight response, this short-term stress, because you perceive something is potentially killing you or injuring you. And so you want to get more oxygen in your blood, and you want to get your blood circulating faster, especially to your muscles. And so all of these help that, the increased heart rate, more air coming in from the dilated airways, more blood flow into your muscles and your heart and your lungs. These are all to make your blood flow faster and with more oxygen to give your muscles more energy. The digestive system organs, they get decreased activity during short-term stress. The epinephrine and norepinephrine cause your digestive system organs to have less activity and less blood flow. And that kind of makes sense because digestion of your food takes a lot of energy and blood flow. And so during a crisis situation of short-term stress, you really can't afford to be sending blood and energy to your digestive system. And so that's why the digestive system shuts down under the influence of the epinephrine and the norepinephrine. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of our discussion of the adrenal gland. Just to do a super quick summary, the adrenal gland has two parts, the adrenal cortex, the part on the outside, and the adrenal medulla, the part on the inside. The adrenal cortex secretes several steroid hormones, the major ones being aldosterone and the other ones being the glucocorticoids, of which cortisol is an example. Aldosterone helps your body regulate the sodium levels in the blood. The glucocorticoids helps you through periods of long-term stress. The adrenal medulla secretes hormones that see you through periods of short-term stress, and these hormones are the hormone epinephrine and norepinephrine, which in some cases acts like a neurotransmitter, but in other cases, as in this case, it's secreted into the bloodstream, so it can also act as like a hormone. And that brings us to the end of our lecture on the endocrine system and the hormones. So as usual, I advise you to now do the online review questions for this topic, and I will see you in the next lecture.